My name is Pierre Atlas. I serve as director of the Richard G. Lugar Franciscan Center for Global Studies here at Marian. Thank you for coming, and I'd like to welcome all of you. It's a little chilly outside, but at least we don't have any snow. We had a very nice meeting with students in the Global Studies program this evening just before coming down with Senator Lugar. President Elsner was able to join us, and he's here tonight as well. And so we'll have a really nice evening. I'd like to take a couple minutes and tell you a little bit about the Global Studies program and about our speaker, and then I'll turn it over to Senator Lugar. So this is the 15th year of the Global Studies Speaker Series. And the Lugar Franciscan Center for Global Studies consists of two parts. There's an academic program in Global Studies where we have a minor in Global Studies that fits with any major at Marian University in the liberal arts and sciences or the professional studies, nursing, business, and education. How many people here are in the Global Studies program? Raise your hand. Very good. Okay. We also have the speaker series. As I said, it's the 15th year of the program. All of our events are free and open to the public. Hopefully you picked up a brochure on your way in. We have this is our last speaker series event of this semester, and then we have some really interesting events coming up next semester. We're bringing in Dr. Hotez, who is the dean of the Center for the National School of Tropical Medicine at Baylor College of Medicine in Houston, Texas, and he's speaking on the rise of poverty-related neglected diseases, and that's co-sponsored by Eli Lilly and Company and the Center for Interfaith Cooperation. And then in February, that's in January, and then in February and March, we have a two-part series on energy and sustainability. In February, former Indianapolis Mayor Greg Ballard will be our speaker, speaking on oil and national security and the need to move away from oil. And then in March, we have a panel discussion on renewable energy and sustainable development with Jesse Carbonda, who is Executive Director of Hoosier Environmental Council, Andrea Richter, who's a Senior Advisor for International Engagement at the Indiana Economic Development Corporation, and she's a former State Department official, David Raposo of the United States Trade and Development Agency, he'll be coming in from Washington, and Peter Schubert, who is a colleague of mine in a sense. He is the director of the Richard Lugar Center for Renewable Energy at IUPUI, and that will be the panel discussion in March, and that'll be our last event of the season. All of these are free and open to the public, and I hope that you'll be able to come. I was going over some material the other night, and came to realize that exactly 10 years ago yesterday, December 9th, 2007, we renamed the Franciscan Center for Global Studies in honor of Senator Richard G. Lugar. And we renamed it the Richard Lugar Franciscan Center for Global Studies. That was 10 years ago yesterday. And Senator Lugar gave a tremendous speech. I'm going to quote a passage of it from you in a minute. But I wanted to say that since that time, he has done a tremendous amount for Marian University and for the Global Studies program. He's given an annual address every year since then. So I think this is the 10th year that you've done this as a Global Studies speaker. He also helped set up our Washington, D.C. program over spring break, where I've taken students to Washington, D.C. And we used to operate out of Senator Lugar's office for the week. And we visit an international embassy and all this. And I still do that with students. And it's just been a tremendous thing. And he meets with students and is very dedicated to our program and to our students, and it's been wonderful. And so it was 10 years ago. President Elsner basically went to Washington, met with Senator Lugar. We put together a proposal, and this was it. And basically said, what can I do? I'd like to be engaged with students and all of that. So. 10 years ago when he gave the speech at Marian, at the time it was Marian College, he gave a really important speech on foreign policy and on global studies. And I just want to read one passage from this. And this is what he said. A global studies program is an affirmation that we are part of a much larger world that has intellectual, scientific, and moral wisdom that we need to learn. Students who want to succeed and live the fullest life possible must think globally. They must understand foreign cultures, the interdependence of the world economy, the fragility of the global environment, and many other factors that will affect their lives, even if they choose to devote their talents close to home. Beyond this general consideration, Marian University has the added imperative of fulfilling Franciscan traditions, which by their nature call for a community of learning to achieve the greatest possible respect and understanding of foreign cultures. And I think that's a beautiful passage, and that really captures a lot, both about what we want to do with the center and also what Senator Lugar has stood for his entire life. I don't really need to go through a full biography of Senator Lugar. I think most people know, but perhaps for some of the younger people in the audience, I just want to hit a couple of highlights. Dick Lugar is a fifth-generation Hoosier. He was the mayor of Indianapolis from the 1960s and 1970s. As he was telling our students upstairs, he was a Rhodes Scholar, and his first elected position was on the school board. And as a school board person, he was actually instrumental in bringing free lunches and nutrition to the public schools of Indianapolis. And then he became mayor. He served in the U.S. Navy. He was a senator for 36 years, the longest-serving senator in Indiana history. On the Foreign Relations Committee for 34 of those years, chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee whenever the Republicans were in charge. He ran for president in 1996, and it was among the Republican candidates in the primaries. And he's been nominated, along with Sam Nunn, for Nobel Peace Prize for the Nuclear Threat Reduction Initiative, which denuclearized 4 former Soviet republics after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And that's just some of the stuff that he does. He's now in Washington, D.C., president of the Lugar Center, and does a lot of things related to renewable energy, food security, nuclear threat reduction, all these kinds of things. A very active person in retirement, and it is my real pleasure to introduce Dick Lugar.
I was complimenting Dr. Atlas and obviously President Elsner for their leadership here on this campus, with students who are interested in global issues, global security, foreign policy, who want to serve in their countries and in this country. And I look forward always to this opportunity to meet with so many of you who have faithfully returned year after year to hear more about my thoughts on foreign policy and to raise very appropriate questions. Tonight I want to discuss 5 areas of foreign policy. There certainly are a great number of others, but I've selected 5 at least that may be sufficiently informative or provocative for our consideration tonight. And the first is the question and the importance of alliances. By alliances, I mean groups like NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Why do I select that to begin with? Because European countries for centuries had warfare almost every year. Not all of them were involved, but various states, various elements within states were in conflict. The United States came into 2 world wars through wars that were occurring in Europe. Now we have a situation subsequent to World War II of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. And we've had peace for well over half a century in Europe. It's miraculous if you look at the totality of European history. It's so important that that alliance remain very, very strong. I appreciate that there has been criticism from time to time that not all of the NATO members are paying their dues or paying their share and so forth. And there's no particular reason why they shouldn't do more, but at the same time, the importance of their adhering to so-called Article 5. This is the article that says, if any of us see our sovereignty violated, see an invasion of our countries, all the rest are obligated to come to our rescue. This is an extraordinary Article 5, but it has kept the peace in Europe. It's offered a foundation for the United States to deal commercially, intellectually, and academically with tourism, with people coming and going for this half century. Very, very important. It is not the only treaty, but it is conspicuous by the number of countries involved and the success of the treaty. We have treaties and strong alliances with Japan and with South Korea, for example. These are very important for those 2 countries as well as for us. We have long had a very strong relationship with Australia. We have a growing relationship with Indonesia and other Southeast Asian countries. I mention this because one of the elements of our authority in the world is the fleet of the United States Navy. That fleet is by far the largest, most comprehensive, and most present everywhere of any fleet. It literally keeps the peace. It keeps the ships flowing in terms of international trade, quite apart from tourism and what have you. It keeps the United States' presence in almost all parts of the world. The world depends upon the United States fleet. And the Southeast Asian countries that I've mentioned, plus Japan and South Korea, really are dependent upon that too, and the fact that they see those ships and they are close at hand. There are other alliances that we have had from time to time, but I select those to begin with. The European alliance and the Asian allies. We may, in fact, forge more alliances in years to come, but these are a starter, and they lead to a second point. These alliances lead to trade agreements. Now, we have not only the trade agreements with the countries I've mentioned, but even more importantly, locally, with the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, that includes Mexico and Canada. This is the basis for peace and security and prosperity in our own part of the world. It's a very important treaty. It has led to considerable growth in Mexico and Canada, as well as the United States. Sometimes it's overlooked, but it should not be by any student of foreign policy. I appreciate that currently the administration has been in negotiations with Canada and Mexico about elements of NAFTA that our country believes need to be improved. I'm hopeful those negotiations will come to a successful conclusion soon, that there will not be any undermining of the importance of that particular agreement, because it enhances, first of all, the trade that we have with those who are close to us. Now, equally important are all of the trade agreements that we have, of course, with the European countries and with other countries around the world. One of the saddest aspects of our trade situation is that a very well-negotiated treaty called TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, that was to bring together most of the countries in the Pacific, with the United States really taking the leadership role. The current administration has decided that we do not want to be a part of that treaty. This has meant, at least for the time being, unless we change our minds, that the Chinese will be the leader of that particular situation. It will, in fact, happen. It's not going to be disbanded because we've decided to stand aside. But I mention that because this may be of interest to many of you. The Trans-Pacific Partnership is one that is going to grow and needs to have at least methods of adjudication of trade disputes, as well as the possibilities for enhanced amount of trade. I touch upon the trade situation with one further thought, and that is that trade frequently leads to immigration. Sometimes the immigration is legal, and people obtain citizenship rights in the various countries to which they go, and sometimes it's illegal. We have to contend with both situations in this country. What I am hopeful likewise in the near future is that we will once again fashion immigration legislation that very clearly sets out what our policies are going to be, how people obtain citizenship. It would also try to identify all of the people who are now living in our country who are not citizens and the reasons they are here and the legitimacy of their being here or the role they might play as citizens. I mention that because obviously the trade disputes and the immigration disputes have been a part of our national political scene in the past year or so. And these are areas we need to get straightened out and do so fairly promptly. There are some special aspects of this. As I visited with the students this evening, we did not get into the DACA program, DACA, which is sometimes known as the dreamers problem. These are young people who came to the United States, frequently with parents who came illegitimately to our country. These young people have lived here in many cases for 10 or 15 years. They have attended our schools, sometimes our colleges, sometimes taken very important jobs. Very talented people, very dedicated to our country, but in danger of being sent out of the country because they do not have citizenship papers. And we're going to have to work things out on the basis of the merits of the cases that we have in mind. We've started with alliances, but we've also started, likewise, at a second point, with thinking through the trade problems, thinking through the immigration problems, the people flowing here and there. And we're going to have to be helpful to our allies in NATO, who have really borne the burden of the huge Syrian refugee problem. It's estimated that well over 1 million Syrians have left that country, maybe closer to 2 million. Maybe 500,000 have landed in Germany. There are some who feel that the status of Angela Merkel as the leader of Germany has been jeopardized by the fact that she was rather generous in allowing, for humane reasons, so many refugees to come into her country. But in any event, these problems are not going to go away. They are a part of the work that we have to do with our NATO allies, as well as to legitimize our own situation in this country on both trade and immigration issues. And I am hopeful that we will act constructively and promptly, with eyes wide open, to the possibilities that are involved, as well as the potential liabilities. Now, we have a third area that has a treaty aspect to it, although no treaty has been formulated, but an agreement called the Paris Agreement has been formulated, in which most of the countries that are of any size in the world have decided that we all have a problem on this planet. It's sometimes called climate change, sometimes called the buildup of CO2. However one wants to characterize this, there has always been debate as to whether, even if there is climate change going on, it is man-made as opposed to simply a natural phenomenon over which we really have very little control. Now, most of the scientific community, and I subscribe to this viewpoint of view, is that human beings are contributing a great deal to the climate change situation, and it's not moving in a very good direction. One of the things that people of the age of most of us who are sitting here tonight may not worry about is that the cataclysmic changes that are suggested will probably not occur during our lifetimes. But with the students that I just met at least a half an hour ago, they will face this. They will face the prospects that the waters may rise to begin with around many countries, quite apart from islands that may be submerged, that we will see probable changes. As we've been hit this year in extraordinary ways, not necessarily by climate change, but we've noted the tremendous destruction in Florida and Texas, quite apart from Puerto Rico and so forth. These are situations that already have been replicated around the world. I remember going to a conference years ago when I was mayor of Indianapolis. We were really not talking very much about climate change in those days, but there were already some problems that mayors were facing. One of them was that from time to time there did seem to be a sizable change in the climate in our communities, which led to rivers overflowing, canals rising, quite apart from those who lived along the ocean shores. And so we did not really get into a philosophical discussion of who was responsible for all of this. We got into a discussion, what do you do if you're mayor and suddenly you have thousands of citizens jeopardized by water that comes up in ways that you might not have anticipated? How do you handle the hospitalization or the transportation or the utilities or all of it? And I remember very well working through all of that at a conference in which I learned a great deal. Unfortunately, was not faced with those sorts of situations, although some of my mayor friends were in due course. But the climate change situation, in my judgment, is not going to go away. It is one in which the Chinese and the Japanese and the people in India, who are very large populations, and particularly the Chinese often testify at these meetings, that their large cities have such polluted air, such smoke in the air, that you don't really want to go outside. This is already happening in their cities to make life, if not unbearable, certainly very, very difficult, if not dangerous. So this is an area where people, whether they are on the right or the left in terms of their outlook internationally, do see real problems now, and the need for there to be literally an international coming together on how we're going to deal with CO2 or with whatever else we're going to deal with. Now, at least temporarily, the United States has decided to leave the Paris Agreement. I hope we will reconsider that and come back to talk to our allies. Certainly many people will be talking to them informally anyway, whether the United States is a part of this, but it certainly undermines the strength of this in terms of our international relations, not to be working with countries. There is no treaty at this point. There are no specific assignments by country that you have to, there are some general goals that we want to try to stop the rise of temperature, which is occurring each year. It has risen without fail now for many years in a row, and that alone has led to the melting of a lot of the ice in the Arctics. One reason why politically there are some new agreements needed is that so much melting has occurred that it's now possible for many naval craft to go through the Arctic Sea. And the question is, whose sea is this? What are the boundary lines? What are the responsibilities? The Russians certainly have some ideas as to who ought to be in charge up there. And we are going to need to face that problem because of the melting right away, even while we're arguing about climate change. So that's a particular area that I think needs our consideration, that has not received it thus far. Now, another point that I want to make, and that is that there are at least two powers presently in which we've had great debate with the international community about nuclear weapons, nuclear power. One of the aspects that has been most frightening in recent years was the growth of the Iranian program, the development of nuclear weapons in that country. This not only terrified the Middle Eastern countries, but likewise, given the fact that development of missiles that carry warheads this development has occurred rather rapidly, there was the possibility that the Iranians would be in a position in due course to threaten all the countries of Europe, Asia, and perhaps the United States. One of the good things in terms of achievements in international relations in recent years has been the so-called Iran deal. Now, there are many critics of that deal who say it should have done more, should have done this and that. But the Iran deal came about because the United States, Russia, and China, all three, plus the European countries, decided to come together to push the Iranians, and we pushed them by very strong economic sanctions, which were a real threat to their economy and to some extent the political regime that was in charge of Iran. After the pain became sufficient, the Iranians became more serious, and a deal was struck, not for the permanent end of the nuclear program of Iran, but for a 10-year postponement in which there would be an International Atomic Energy Agency, their inspectors internationally, taking a look at all of the sites in which activity was occurring and making certain that the world knew that there was transparency about all of this. It was a remarkable agreement that finally gained passage in the United States after a very, very bitter struggle in Congress and in most other countries of the world. It, however, is there now, and this at least brought some relief to that particular area. All that was occurring about the time that we became aware that the North Korean leader was taking very serious steps to develop a nuclear program in North Korea. That program, as we all know because we read about it frequently now, has progressed to the point in which we often see in the press pictures of the North Korean leader examining the weapons. I've been a part of intelligence briefings that are even much more descriptive and show what is occurring in the laboratories and how big the pieces of this and that are and all the rest of it. So we know a great deal about the weapons, and the North Korean leader wants us to know a lot about it. He wants us to know that he's trying to develop missiles that would carry nuclear warheads to the United States. The last big test was one in which there at least was some thought that the height of the missile as it went up and finally fell into the Sea of Japan, if you straightened it out, it could have gotten to the United States. And so the question then is this missile capable right now of carrying the weight of a nuclear warhead that would in fact have the same effect, not only of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the nuclear attacks we made on Japan in World War II, but for that matter, those were fairly small warheads. What we now face in this world, and I became aware of this when I was working with my partner, Senator Sam Nunn of Georgia, in our non-nuclear cooperative threat reduction program. We went to all the countries of the former Soviet Union, at least annually and sometimes more often, to examine the progress of warheads and missiles. One time I was in eastern part of Russia at a place where they just pulled a large missile up out of the ground. This missile was probably 80 to 100 feet in length. It had 12 warheads attached to it. They were called semi-reactive vehicles, which meant that they could go to 12 different places on Earth. They had the elements in them once you got the missile up out of there. I went down into the hole where the missile had been withdrawn, and there was a table there where the guards who were responsible for this had been sitting, and around the wall were pictures of American cities. Well, of course, instinctively, I went to the wall to see whether Indianapolis was pictured. I did not find a picture of Indianapolis, was relieved temporarily. But when I got back to the Pentagon, I said, just out of curiosity, was Indianapolis targeted? And they said, well, sure. Why in the world would you have any other idea? Every city of any size in the United States of America was targeted by a nuclear warhead to be aimed at it if, in fact, the missile came out of the ground that had those warheads. And unlike the warheads that hit Nagasaki and Hiroshima in Japan, these are warheads now that it was described to me that one or two of them could have wiped Indianapolis off the face of the earth. Now, for 40 years, we had a period of so-called mutually assured destruction. It described the fact that both the United States and Russia, or the former Soviet Union, had really about 10 to 12,000 warheads of this size and scope that were targeted deliberately to hit every military installation, every city of any size in both of our two countries. Miraculously, nothing was fired in that 40-year period of time. But I mention this because we came finally to a point in which we were taking down these warheads, and we've now reduced them to 1,550 under the last New START agreement to each country, which is still a lot, and many more than any other countries have. This is still a very dangerous world. It may have just been a personal thought, but I thought, gee, all the 8 years that I was serving as mayor of Indianapolis, a mistake could have occurred. We could have been wiped out during that period of time, whether I knew about it or not. I know a great deal more about it now, and even that, it worries me with regard to the whole business. In other words, we have a situation in this world in which we are still working not only on nuclear weapons, but chemical weapons and biological weapons, the so-called weapons of mass destruction. There is still a great deal of work to be done. But this takes us back to the North Korean problem, because here, at this point, we do not have negotiations underway. We don't have a non-Lugar agreement. We don't have any agreement. It is often written about in the press or on the news shows. Would the North Korean leader even accommodate people who want to talk about this from other countries, who want to think through really what needs to happen? Because we have a very dangerous situation as it stands. I hope the Iran situation will never become dangerous again, but it may have potential. And so, for that matter, could the situations that are rarely mentioned, the nuclear weapons held by India and Pakistan, we believe that they are aimed at each other over Kashmir or other disputes out there, but nevertheless they are in existence on this planet. This is still a potentially dangerous world in which all of us are going to have to pay some attention to this, as well as, I say, to the chemical and biological situations, which have been rounded up a little bit more satisfactorily, but certainly not entirely. I mention all these things this evening with one final thought, and I do not have any particular knowledge of this. I read about as much as I can, talk to people who are into this, but I remember not long ago going to a luncheon in Washington, former intelligence officers. They call it the AFIO. Each year they have a luncheon in which people who have served in the intelligence community come together. And there was on that occasion a situation in which an editor of the New York Times, who was very knowledgeable about circular warfare, really came to talk about all of this. Now, I don't know that much about cloud technology, about how cybersecurity might come about, but I do know that a great number of people are talking about the fact, and this already was occurring. This is what the New York Times reporter was telling us that day, but his channels had just said that there had been a cybersecurity attack on a number of hospitals in Europe and other places. This has always been a potential danger. By cybersecurity, I mean the ability to shut down banks, shut down hospitals, shut down police departments. You don't send people over here as troops to do this. There's no invasion. It happens through the sophistication of communications and cloud technology in this world. So in addition to weapons that we have been thinking about, nuclear, biological, chemical, we now have a whole new raft of situations that the ingenuity of mankind has been able to conjure up. And we're going to have to come to grips with that and learn much more about it and how we erect defenses, or if, as in the case earlier, as I talked about, we have the problem of the rising seas, how we would react. In this community, if our police department, or our hospitals, our banks, what have you, were hit and shut down someday, how do you deal sort of day by day under those circumstances? These have become issues of foreign policy very different from nation-to-nation warfare or the things that we started with this evening. But very important considerations. That's why I bring them to our attention tonight, to begin thinking about it. Or if you've already begun thinking about it, read more, talk more, and try to find out, as I am attempting to do, really what kind of leadership is going to be required to deal with these very, very provocative situations in the world. Now, finally, on a good note, I mentioned to begin with our fleet. It represents the fact that after all is said and done, the United States is the leader of the world. We are the only country, literally, that can transport people and goods and services everywhere with a very high degree of safety, with people of goodwill, people who in our military services and civilian service who represent us well. I'll never forget that. This is very, very important. And it gives us at least an open door in most occasions to talk to people, to negotiate with people, to think with them about a world that is safer, a world that is more productive. If, in fact, we are able to do that, and we are able to augment and increase our trade, we will increase our income, we will increase our job possibilities, we'll increase the quality of life of new products that we import as well as those that we export. In other words, the prospects for a better life are clearly here, in addition to the threats that I have illustrated on the borders. We all have to make choices to arrive at the right conclusions and the best results for our citizens. And this is why I thank you again for taking time to think with me tonight about some of these problems and in your own professions, your own leadership roles, to make a difference. Thank you so very much, and I'd be pleased to try to respond to your thoughts and questions. Papers that have come to a conclusion as to what that limit might be, or what ideally it could be. I suspect that in many countries there has been a loss of population. In some, of course, a much greater gain. We believe that the Chinese population continues to grow, and likewise that of India, and these are very, very large countries. But it would appear that many countries in Africa are not having a growth of population, maybe some even in Latin America. But it's a good question. It could be, as you maybe suggest, a question as to how you have sustainability if you have huge changes in population. One of the things that we're doing at this small think tank that I've created in Washington, the Lugar Center, is dealing on world food security, for example. We have some former staff members from the Agriculture Committee who are working on that particular problem with others who have been working on it for quite some time. And we're thinking through how the United States can produce enough, for example, to make certain that there is sort of an insurance policy for the rest of the world. Now, sometimes, of course, in our efforts in this respect, there are other countries who want to protect their farmers. They don't want anything coming in, even if their populations are not doing very well. This is sad, but this is the nature of politics in many situations. On the other hand, I'm impressed with the fact that not only in the United States but elsewhere in the world, we are increasing the yields of basic crops. I would just say, as a personal note, on the Lugar Farm down here in Decatur Township, we have 604 acres in corn, soybeans, and hardwood trees. The corn crop this year had a yield of 190.11 bushels to the acre. That's a record for us. As a boy, I remember my dad talking about 50 bushels to the acre when I was out there working on the farm. In my lifetime, I've seen almost a fourfold increase on the same land. Why? Because we've changed seeds, fertilizer, soil management, all sorts of things. That's occurring all over the world where it's permitted by governments. Sometimes ruthless governments make it a habit of trying to starve oppositions. But getting back to your basic question, it's a good one to keep track of the population all over the world, to keep track of how many people are facing food insecurity in a very tragic way, or other forms of security, and act upon that data as we collect it.
Does the current administration seek out your knowledge and expertise in some of these areas you've spoken about tonight? And if not, can you offer your expertise?
Well, I'm available, yeah. I would say that the current administration has not been active in asking for my opinions. On the other hand, due to the fact that I'm asked by many papers or magazines or what have you to offer op-ed columns or articles, or by various groups to give talks and speeches. Sometimes I will pair with somebody from another state, another party. In other words, to give some thought that at least this is not just singular thoughts about all this, but I must say that this has not been an administration that I've been active in.
With your expertise as a senator, obviously there's a big controversy with Roy Moore in Alabama. If he is elected, and there's talks about him being like either not seated, which I know they can't do, but perhaps being expelled. What are the options in the Senate if he gets elected and even Republicans in the Senate don't want him there? What can the Senate do?
Well, this is a very tough question just 48 hours or so before we know the outcome of that election. Clearly already, many have indicated that they are not certain that he ought to be seated to begin with, and that if he was, that the Ethics Committee or whoever takes responsibility for this may very well want to conduct hearings. It's going to be a difficult situation because this revolution that's occurred not just in politics but in the entertainment world, in the business world, in which women have come forward and said we have been violated, grossly violated, and we're no longer going to stand for it. In the past, why it may have been that women said, in order to save my job, in order to save my reputation, a variety of reasons, I suffered through all of this without making anything about it. But now we're really cresting into something that is huge. And my guess is that for weeks and months to come, not just with Mr. Moore, but with people all over the country in various ways, we're going to have all kinds of confessions and allegations and what have you, because this is a sort of a wave that has suddenly hit, and people feel much more comfortable and safe in coming forward. So it's in that context that this candidate suddenly comes to the Senate, as Senator Franken has announced this week that he will be leaving. He hasn't given a date, but fairly soon. And another member of the House, less well-known than Senator Franken, likewise this week resigned. I have no idea how many more may do so in due course, but one could not have predicted even a month ago we would have had already this kind of change even in the congressional roster. Well, it's a good question, and I don't know the answer. I would say that I'm very grateful for each of the opportunities that I've had to do programs with Lee Hamilton, whom you've mentioned. And we're, in fact, chairman, co-chairs of an advisory committee to the new international school at Indiana University, and have been conducting programs that last for 2 or 3 days in which people are invited, not just the students there, but from around the Indiana community to come to hear some folks who I think have some very good ideas. Obviously, I've mentioned that we are grateful for invitations to write op-eds for papers, to do television interviews and what have you. I don't know of any comprehensive way at this point that all of this comes together. I'm not certain that can happen in this country given the diversity of our media. But each one of us in our own way have to do the best we can, and I will try to do my best. Yes? I believe that it was inadvisable to make such an announcement at this particular stage, given the diplomacy that surrounds that issue. I suspect, as do many who have written about this, that there will not be, as a matter of fact, a change in the location for some time, for months, maybe even for years. So you ask, well, why was an announcement made by the president? That's his business and that of his colleagues who may have had reasons. But at the same time, there are so many factors involved and so many other players in that drama that this, I think, is a situation unlikely to change for the foreseeable future.
I guess there, in the mind of some people, that in order to obtain peace, you have to have war. In other words, how to solve this problem with North Korea, how to solve these problems with Iran without going to war, without, I guess you've done it so well with the disarmament, and so what would you have to say to those that are the hawkish amongst our leaders?
Well, I would just very strongly advise giving diplomacy not only a chance, but a long chance, many chances. I just simply believe, and I think the Middle East is a good example of this currently, that going to war might, as a matter of fact, change circumstances temporarily for countries there, but only temporarily. By that I mean, for example, we went to a war in Iraq, and perhaps for good reasons, but at the same time, Iraq at that time was really a country with Shiites and Sunnis and Kurds who were incompatible. One reason why they didn't have a democracy with regular elections and a parliament and a president and so forth was that these three groups were not going to be involved in a constitutional situation. Now, we thought that clearly they would, after we defeated the dictator, that people would be delighted to have our support and maybe our guidance in setting up a new presidency and a parliament. And there is such a thing in Iraq. But as you've read currently, the Kurds, with whom we were visiting and fighting over in Syria recently, are at war literally as a PKK group in Turkey. And the Iranians likewise do not want to see a Kurdistan. And so as a result, there's a real mess up in the northern part of Iraq. The Sunnis and the Shiites still can't get along in the other two-thirds. And it spreads right across Syria. They're trying to describe Syria on the map as to who is in charge of what and where. Saddam Hussein is the, well, you have a leader of the Syrians, but you have all sorts of other small groups. We have, by warfare, perhaps eradicated most of the ISIS strongholds, but now these people are showing up in Libya or in African countries as terrorists. They don't have a so-called caliphate, an actual setup of a state. They're just simply people that are still on the run causing trouble. I don't want to belabor the issue, but this is a problem, to say the least, in terms of setting up states, of setting up situations in which people we believe should be living in peace, and which we offer a great deal of foreign aid to help them do that, offer a great deal of political advice. I suppose that some would say it goes back to the time that the European countries literally drew the boundaries of countries in the Middle East. And they drew them, they thought, around various groups, and that they would be compatible within those situations, but it hasn't turned out that way. And it's not clear we could draw those lines now either. Now, what some suggest is that, therefore, we ought to keep American troops in each of these situations so long as there is trouble. But it's not clear who will be fighting on each of these occasions. And even if we don't really want to occupy Syria, nor Iraq, but it finally comes down to the fact that if we are not there, fighting does occur, and it's not clear who's going to be in charge. And so it's a mess. I think that our own foreign policy people will really need to come up with a much more apparent strategy for the use of our forces, either peaceful or military, as opposed to suddenly sending 2,000 troops here or a couple of thousand here, or demands they be withdrawn, or thoughts the American people are tired of the whole thing and they ought to have come out. That really isn't working. Rex Tillerson is a very able man who has offered great leadership for the oil company that he headed. And he also has, because of that, a very good international background. On the other hand, it's not clear what his views are on his own department. By that I mean, there are common complaints that the 7th floor of the State Department is virtually empty, which means that all the positions that are there, no one has been appointed. And there is a thought maybe no one will be appointed. We have ambassadors, I believe, at last count, only in about a third of the countries of the world, because others have not been nominated. Or where they have been nominated, the Congress has not seen fit to have hearings and to confirm them and to get them over there. In short, we have a diminished State Department in terms of personnel and in terms of the services that are normally offered in the diplomatic front at this particular stage. And at least sometimes Secretary Tillerson seems to be quoted as saying that the Congress has been demanding that the State Department budget be reduced very substantially, and that therefore he's following orders from somewhere that there be this diminishing. those of us who have been involved, for instance, I mentioned the world food security problems in foreign aid of any sort, have found that there is a real disagreement as to how much foreign aid, whether it be food or anything else, the United States ought to be offering to other countries, in which my own belief is that our foreign aid process has made a huge difference in terms of the United States' reputation and strength in many, many countries all over the world, quite apart from helping to keep the peace and move things along in a more prosperous situation. So these are reflections on, and I don't know the answers. So why Secretary Tillerson, or whether he is under orders from the White House staff or the President to take action or not to take action, but it's apparent that there are some gaps here. And this is a year into the administration, and there will have to be some gaps filled rapidly for the security of the people in those countries as well as our own foreign policy.
Do you have any suggestion in how we are able to better distribute our food resources to places with extreme hunger?
Well, here we've had a breakthrough of sorts, and there is clearly disagreement about it. But I offered legislation a long while ago that did not pass at the time, but now is occurring somehow through administrative fiat, I gather. One of the ways in which we can help feed people in many countries that are far away from us is literally to use American funds to buy food in that country that we're trying to feed. And in that way, we are able to not only strengthen the agriculture community of that country, but we were able to get food at very short transportation and distances to the people that we're trying to aid. If you ask, well, why haven't we done this in the past? Well, first of all, because American farmers, some said, well, why in the world are we buying food in X country as opposed to producing it here in the United States, having greater demand for our food that we would export. But the real block has been the transportation problem. The shipping people and others have said, no, we want food produced in the United States. It must go on American vessels or aircraft or what have you to the country and then be distributed there at that stage. And that has been a very difficult thing to bring off. So as I say now, at least for a variety of reasons, we are in fact buying food, and this is stimulating production and those economies and getting the food to the people fast, not months from the time that starvation is being reported. So I'm encouraged by this. Now, I have not seen enough of it, and I've not seen the data on it, and I will be looking for it. But in answer to your question, we're in a course, at least I think, of making a change.
Well, thank you, Senator Lugar. We are going to have a reception outside with light refreshments. You can meet Senator Lugar and talk to him if you'd like. I would like to not only thank you for coming here again this year, but thank you for being such a voice of reason for your entire professional life, and I think we need it more than ever, and I really appreciate everything that you had to say tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very nice.